Over 10% of all the farmland on this planet is right here in the United States. It's undeniably our most important natural resource. Agriculture faces clear challenges. We're losing 2,000 acres of farmland every day. We want to really increase the amount of farmland that's protected in this country. The best strategy is to permanently protect it with an agricultural conservation easement. An agricultural easement is a legal restriction on a piece of property that makes sure that land will always be available for farming.
The land that we're sitting on right now has tremendous value in being farmland. When American Farmland Trust got here, they realized housing was moving rapidly in Madera, and they saw an opportunity to basically put a plug from one housing tract to another, and it protected 30,000 acres of really, really strong farm ground.
Since our founding in 1980, American Farmland Trust has helped permanently protect over 8 million acres of irreplaceable farmland, advanced better farming practices on millions of acres more, and worked with over 600,000 farm families.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are as you join us here today at the Farm Progress webinar. The title of this presentation is called Your Land is Your Legacy, Conservation Easement Options in Farm Estate Planning. It's sponsored by American Farmland Trust and broadcast by Informa. I'm Jennifer Harrington. I'm actually a staff attorney at the Center for Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Iowa State University, and I'll be the moderator today and kind of introduce you into this topic. However, before we dive in and get into the fun stuff, we do have a few announcements. This webinar is meant to be interactive. The dock of widgets down at the bottom of kind of the screen that you see here will allow you to learn about the speakers that are here today. They'll also have resources available, and they'll allow you to interact with this webinar. We welcome questions at any time. There is a Q&A kind of section. Click on it. Type your question out. We have a team of really wonderful people behind us who are giving those questions and feeding them to us so that we can kind of address them as they come up in our conversation about easements and succession planning. Okay. And on that note, we're going to at least try it out here, make you play along, at least in the beginning. Before we get started, we'd like to push a polling question out to you guys. Our question is, do you have a succession plan? Please choose your response directly on the screen and click submit. We'll share our results here in a minute with you, but I just kind of want to give you guys a few seconds to kind of look at what this platform offers you and know where things are, because hopefully this conversation will spurn a few questions for you and make you guys think a little bit. And with that, hopefully that was enough time for you guys to kind of get your answers in for the polling questions. I know it kind of takes a few seconds, a little bit of time on our end to actually compute the results and kind of close that poll down, but I think we'll be getting there pretty quickly. If you are experiencing any technical problems at any point in today's presentation, click on that help widget, which is found below as well at the bottom of your screen, or you can type the issue into the Q&A area, and the wonderful helpers behind the curtain, if you will be able to offer one-on-one assistance. So we'll keep talking, but there are people who are addressing your question and trying to get those technical issues resolved. With that, I think we can display what the succession planning results are. And we are pretty much tied, actually. So 43.1% say that they do have a succession plan, but 41.3% say that they don't have a succession plan. So that's about average for what we see actually on the high end of people who have actually made a succession plan. But today we can talk about like maybe a tool that can help further your plan, or also possibly, a way to just make sure you are double checking to get the best benefit out of that plan that you made. And for those of you who are beginning the journey, welcome. I know it's a very overwhelming experience to be looking down the barrel of succession planning, but I think that there's a lot to learn from today. So with that, I'm gonna start the presentation. I'm gonna begin with a brief overview of kind of what succession planning is and what I've seen, and then I'll turn to our speakers here, the three gentlemen who have accompanied me, and we'll really dive into kind of what American Farmland Trust can offer the agricultural world during this time. But stepping back real quick, part of the reason I was asked to be a moderator here is because of the questions that I see as my role as staff attorney at ISU. The Center for Ag Law and Taxation has really seen an increase in people coming to us looking for guidance and help when it comes to succession planning. And when I talk about succession planning, I'm not just talking about the estate planning component where we talk about the transfer of the farm assets, but we also talk about, the transfer of the daily management that needs to happen, and then also the big picture management, right? Are we going to acquire more farmland? Do we have an opportunity for a different tax vehicle, a 1031, right? Who are making those decisions? And so succession planning kind of addresses all three of those and make sure that they're actually comprehensive so that production on your farm or on your family's farm can kind of continue on to new owners without kind of experiencing any financial hiccups or family hiccups for that matter, which is the other part. So with that, I kind of have three big tips when it comes to succession planning in general. And my first tip is that you need to find your team. I've got some really great people here with me today. I know some here at the center, we're here to help you as well and kind of give you some information. But ultimately, you're probably going to need to bring together a tax preparer. Make sure yours has the bandwidth to deal with the transition, right? An attorney is likely going to be involved at some level. Your bank might be involved if we really kind of talk about the finances and bringing on a new owner during lifetime. And then possibly your insurance agent for a variety of reasons, both liability and also as that financial piece. So I would say that's probably your top four to kind of get in a row and know who to contact when questions come up. Because one of them might have a question that basically the other expert should know the answer to. So if you have that all decided ahead of time, you're golden. My second point, is that succession, sometimes it's very easy to focus on the estate planning component, right? Like what happens when I am just physically no longer here? But there is a lot more that goes on, right? Succession really focuses on the equity and the management of the operation. And what is equal is not always actually fair for what has been going on in the family situation in years before the transition. And so kind of understanding those concepts and being able to kind of address those issues head on is going to help you out. And then brings me to my third point. And then I'll let the panel get going, but that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure when it comes to this area. Unfortunately, just kind of the apprehension you have about making these plans or the costs that it may have to actually meet with some of these experts really are pennies on the dollar compared to what the back end looks like if there's no planning done or if some family issues arise, right? If we sweep things under the rug, they often become big financial problems further down the road, especially in the farming community. And so you need to be kind of prepared to make decisions, to figure out where your priorities are, unfortunately, when they kind of clash together and you can't have your cake and eat it too. And in those situations. And then you also need to talk to your family and be ready to have those conversations of saying, we're making decisions and this is what we think would work. Is there a blind spot? And then also you want to do your research. At CALT is one of just many things that we have here, but we have an estate and succession planning for the farm book. It goes over trusts, wills, the financial consequences of trying to retire, given depreciation recapture and basis and other fun tax things that we might dive into a little bit here. And so if you want some further information, that's at our website, CALT, but there's plenty of extension information out there And I also know American Farmland Trust actually has some really great 101 documents about how to kind of look at your farm from an asset balance sheet perspective and think about how to transfer management and possibly the assets as you bring in new people. So they're also a great wealth of resources. But with that, we are here to talk about a specific tool of succession planning, and I am very excited to do that. And those are what are referred to as conservation easements. And there's a lot of, I would say, misinformation online or overwhelming information online about what these are. And so I'm really glad that we get to dive into that today. And with us, we have Jerry Cosgrove, who's our Farm Legacy Director and Senior Advisor, Paul Casperson, who is the Director of Planned Giving, and Chris Reynolds, Midwest Regional Director. They all are with American Farmland Trust. If you want to learn, if you want to see their bios, I believe down at the bottom there's like this speakers widget that you can click and see our bios if you're so interested. But we'll give you a quick recap, and we'll start with Paul here. Paul, you're the Director of Planned Giving, but you're also a certified financial planner. So can you briefly explain what American Farmland Trust does and the current issues it provides opportunities for?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jennifer. Well, American Farmland Trust, really our mission is to protect farmland, promote sound farming practices, and to support farmers in a variety of ways. That really distills it down. There's all kinds of really interesting things going on at AFT every day. But one of the things that I want to underscore is that American Farmland Trust is a 501c3 public charity, just like the Nature Conservancy, but we really hone in on, obviously, farmland protection. And I underscore that because our name, American Farmland Trust, kind of throws that off sometimes, but we are a 501c3 public charity. Does that answer your question, Jennifer? I lost the volume.
Oh,
there you are.
Sorry.
Are you back?
Hopefully.
Okay, great.
So my question was, can you maybe speak to the estate tax situation and sometimes why conservation easements are brought up in that conversation?
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that a lot of Americans are looking at right now is preparing and updating their estate planning in light of the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was probably the most recent landmark tax overhaul that we had in the United States. This bill was passed in 2017. And the majority of the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were temporary for 8 years. So they will expire in December of 2025. And at least for estate planning purposes, we could talk about there's at least 40 of these different tax matters that are going to sunset. But for estate planning at the federal level, the federal estate tax exemption has increased significantly temporarily to $13 million per individual, almost, basically $26 million for a married couple, that they can leave behind that much wealth without any federal estate tax. But the concern is that is going to revert back to what it was before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which it was around $5 million adjusted for inflation on an annual basis. So that would take us back probably to about $6.5 to $7 million per person. So that's not insignificant, especially for families that have a significant amount of farmland. And in communicating with the rest of our colleagues here, they reminded me that there are many states, probably about 15 of them, that also have state estate taxes. Now, these aren't temporary necessarily, but those need to be taken into consideration as well in light of a family's estate plans. So you may not be necessarily worried about the federal estate tax, even if it gets cut in half to $7 million per person, 13-14 million for a family, but your state might have a state tax where the exemption starts at $1 million. And so those are some other planning considerations to think of.
Yeah, interesting. I think sometimes we forget about the state estate taxes when we hear about the federal one so often. But I know that impacts you, Chris, because you're actually in Illinois. This is Chris Reynolds. He's our Midwest director at the American Farmland Trust, but he's also a fifth generation farmer on an Illinois farm. And so can I just ask you maybe, how has your experience as a farmer, really influenced your role at American Farmland Trust?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I think across all of the programming that we do, having the perspective as a farmer is really important, whether we're talking about conservation practices or policies. And certainly, my experience with succession planning is varied. I've been part of really good succession planning, and I've also been part of planning that was absent for the most part. So, I know how it affects farmers. I know how, it concerns the next generation of farmers. And, AFT is looking at, we're projecting about 300 million acres of farm and ranch land that will transition in the next 15 years. That's close to 40% of the land in the United States that's being used for some type of farming or ranching. So, it has a big impact. My family, I was very fortunate to have farming on both sides. My parents, my grandparents on both sides were farmers, and there was certainly a lot of planning that went into on one side and a little bit less on the other. I think there was concerns about while my grandparents were alive, how that will be perceived by who's inheriting the land. But certainly both sides, were very passionate about the land and also very passionate about keeping it in the family. And I think that's what was really important. Also keeping it in the family, not just from an ownership perspective, but also wanting to make sure that somebody in the family was still farming that land. And of course, that was me at the time, and I continue to farm, and I've been farming for over 25 years now. And at one point, I had 3 landlords that I was farming for, and now with the passing of all of my grandparents, I have 9 landowners that I'm working with. So it changed significantly for me as a farmer, and I've had, again, some really great experiences with a irrevocable trust that was really a smooth transition from one generation to the next, and also allowed me to continue to farm that land and for that farmland to stay in the family for at least the next couple generations.
Oh, it sounds like you have some great insight, Chris. And I think going through it, unfortunately, sometimes brings in some insights that are hard to see until you're in the thick of it. And so it's nice that you're able to kind of pass that along to the people and the organizations that you work with. And last, but definitely not least, we do have Jerry. Jerry is their senior advisor, but he's the farm legacy director and senior advisor. But you're also an attorney like me, Jerry. And so I'll try not to get too nerdy here. But can you kind of explain why you think succession planning is so vital, and then maybe the role that these conservation easements kind of play when it kind of comes into succession planning and agriculture?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jennifer. I'm so glad to be part of this discussion, and love, have a great team on our panel here and Jennifer's expertise. So we'll, in the overview that Jennifer did, can only say, here to the 3 tips. Again, thinking about it from a team approach, getting started sooner than later, thinking holistically, is really, really important. And it can be daunting. And so getting started is very important, because planning takes time and effort, and probably in many cases will take some resources, financial resources. But again, the ounce of prevention is certainly worth the pound of the cure. In terms of conservation easements, just to sort of cover again a little bit what was on the video, at American Farmland Trust, we really focus on agricultural conservation easements. So we're in the business of protecting land for farming, not from farming. And so it's very important from our perspective that you craft a conservation easement that's going to allow and promote and encourage farming into the future with the flexibility and the stewardship and management decisions that entails. But one of the lessons I learned a long time ago at a presentation actually from a farmer is the fact that conservation easements, which are a very important provision to protect land, they're permanent, but also a very, very big decision and one that needs to be thought through very carefully. And I had a farmer observe to me that, well, it really makes sense to think about conservation easements, but what about my farm transfer plan? You know, what impact is it going to have on my farm, the future farmers? And the question is one that stuck with me for, over 30 years of my career working on these issues, is that it's a great question and it's really important. And I found that integrating farmland protection, focusing on the permanent protection of the land for the long term with farm and succession transfer is really the best opportunity to combine the planning efforts, since they both really involve looking at things over the long term, looking at them holistically, how they interact. And as Paul mentioned, again, conservation easements, depending on where you are, can certainly help reduce the value of an estate because you're removing development value permanently. It can really help with potential estate tax issues. There are income tax benefits for those who can utilize those. And to me, integrating farmland protection and conservation easements is a great opportunity. It's an area that American Farmland Trust, again, sees both pieces of the equation as being critically important. And really, again, in the planning process, it's a good time to think about the long-term future of the land. I really look at conservation easements as an insurance policy for the land. We take out insurance policy on our lives for financial reasons, but easements, do protect the land permanently into the future for agricultural use.
Well, that actually segs me into my first follow-up question, and Jerry, I'm gonna direct it at you, not to just keep you going. Chris, Paul, I promise I have questions for you as well. But you brought up these conservation easements, and can you kind of explain? They are a restriction on the deed, so sometimes people are more familiar with that term than easement, right? Deed restriction. Can you kind of explain how they're different than other deed restrictions that farmers kind of more typically see throughout the years?
Yeah, there's some legal distinctions, and then there's some practical considerations. The legal distinctions are that the conservation easement, in order to be enforceable, needs to be held by a nonprofit conservation organization like American Farmland Trust, which again only holds the power and the obligation to enforce the restrictions. The other entity that can hold them are governmental entities, either federal, state, or local. Easements, to be eligible for the estate tax and income tax deductions need to be permanent. What they restrict is primarily uses that would interfere with production agriculture, primarily residential development for non-agricultural purposes, obviously outside residences that would be needed for farm workers or the farm family, and commercial development that would be non-agricultural, again, recognizing that agricultural is certainly its own commercial use. Those are the main restrictions. Again, most of the other restrictions are relating to special resource areas, if you've got wetlands or stream corridors or maybe sensitive steep slopes. But by and large, those are the main restrictions. Again, trying to keep the land for available for future agricultural use. And one of the things that misnomer and misconceptions is agricultural conservation easements do not require any kind of public access. Now, landowners, in most cases, almost all cases, reserve that right to themselves. Again, as in most cases, they reserve the right to allow people to access the land for hunting or other uses or not.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that really helped clarify the issue. And Chris, when you've been working with farmers who have utilized this method, Can you kind of talk about what, if any, impact you see on like day-to-day operations or on maybe like year decisions, annual decisions that need to be made? What do you see happens after the conservation or easement is placed on the land?
Yeah, well, I think, an easement can provide that landowner with some more equity into that farm operation for one. And I think it just gives them the peace of mind knowing that that land is going to be protected for future generations. And so I think they're, a really valuable tool that can be used. I work here in the Midwest where, state farmland protection programs are fairly absent. We have, I think, about 29 or 30 states across the U.S. that have state purchase of ag conservation easement programs, but fairly absent of those programs here in the Midwest. And so it's one of the things that we're trying to do is to establish new programs and also reestablish funding in states that currently have those. And that's really important right now because we're seeing a large influx of funding through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the Ag Land Easement Program with NRCS, and states that don't have these programs, like the state that I'm from, it's really hard for them to leverage funding to bring in more USDA funds. And so we know from talking with farmers that these benefits are real, that they're experiencing on their farms, and they just have that peace of mind, I think, that the land is going to be maintained in agriculture. But beyond that, it's nothing really changes in their operation. They continue to make those same decisions on their farm with what they're going to grow based on the drivers within the marketplace.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of explaining it. Good job. I really appreciate that. Paul or Jerry, I don't know between the two. Maybe Paul, you want to take a whack at this one first, but will this kind of easement influence or impact my ability to sell the farm, right? That's a question we usually get, right? Like I put this deed restriction on. What does that mean if for some reason I would need to liquidate a portion, or if I go to sell it to my son, right? Or my daughter, right? What does this mean for that process?
Sure. Well, it's the sale of the property is going to always be subject to the easement perpetually. Audience of future purchasers of that land interest in it, and that's going to be for the operation of farmland. So it's going to rule out developers, and if that's your goal, you're gonna lose that audience, but you're gonna gain farmland in perpetuity. But to answer your question directly, Jen, no, it wouldn't. You wouldn't have any real legal issues selling land, subject to the easement. But Jerry, you might want to add something to that.
Just to say that's absolutely right. It's going to limit the pool of buyers, and again, the point is to limit the pool of buyers to those who want to maintain the agricultural production into the future. So, developers, residential or commercial, or perhaps even large scale solar developers are not going to be interested in your land because they'll look at the deed restriction and understand that it is not going to allow the use that they might be willing to pay a premium for. So that, that's one of the reasons why, as Chris mentioned, we've long supported programs where landowners actually receive the value of the equity that they give up in a publicly funded program. We wish at AFT we had a privately funded program to compensate landowners. We don't. That said, for some landowners who are willing to make a charitable donation, you can convey an easement, get an income tax deduction, an estate and gift tax deduction. Again, really, in those cases, it's because the landowners, is making the individual choice and exercise their property rights to keep the land permanently protected and available for future agricultural production. Again, it's sort of the core of AFT and many of our members who believe that we need our farmland for the future, and that's an important legacy to protect moving forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm just kind of looking at some of the questions that they came in, and I think maybe you touched on this, but I want to highlight this, right? And the question basically is, could one of these easements restrict a like a solar or a wind development? Like how would those two things interact if somebody was approached to say, put some solar panels on 15 acres?
You know, the short answer is most easements will prohibit large scale wind or solar. Again, one of the great things about conservation easements is that you can craft them with the individual characteristics of a parcel of land or a farm or ranch in mind. So it may be that you've got a large farm and maybe there are some acres that you would want to allow for future solar or wind development on. Again, one of the planning issues with easements, are sort of that impact how you go about the easement, or certainly the business plans. You want to make sure there's sufficient flexibility for future expansion. There's land planning. Again, if you've got uses on your property where you may think, well, there's a section of land that might be appropriate for wind or solar on a larger scale. You think that through in advance. Obviously, the tax and financial planning that Paul referenced, and then certainly it can and should be part of an estate plan. Again, looking at all the planning issues, circling all the way back to what Jennifer started with. Planning is really critical. It takes time, and you need to invest that time and energy up front. So there's a lot of flexibility. One of the things I think makes the conservation easement a great tool is you need to tailor it. It's not cookie cutter. It needs to fit the landowner and the farmer and the succession planning needs and the land itself.
I think that's a very important part, Jerry. I think sometimes gets missed with people, and it's something that American Farmland Trust really brings. Your organization does is an understanding that not every farm is the same, and even every parcel within a farming operation is not farmed the same, right? And I think that's not, we don't always get all that knowledge when dealing with some of these experts. And there was an interesting question in the chat, and maybe Chris, maybe you can opine your thoughts about this, because the question in the chat is like, why are we calling them conservation easements? And I know the answer to this kind of deals more with the Internal Revenue Code. But I think maybe Chris, maybe you can have a way of explaining that maybe makes more sense to people on why we're calling them conservation easements, even though, most of the time we definitely still farm in conventional practices on these grounds. We can adopt new technology, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think you're correct. I think we've just, based on the code, that's typically what we refer to them as conservation easements, conservation agriculture easements. And I think it can be challenging to communicate because, to landowners, because I also think, they're also thinking about it from a, maybe they're putting it in conservation or natural areas. We certainly have a lot of land trusts that work specifically with natural areas. So I think there's often some confusion that around that as well. And so I think we try to communicate, that these are specific to agriculture, keeping it in farming. And I also think, we're talking about conserving farmland. We certainly do a lot of work around conservation practices. And I think our work here in the Midwest, we try to couple these things. We try to couple farmland protection with conservation. We're not necessarily requiring that through easements, but we are also letting farmers and landowners know that, it's great that you want to protect your land and keep it in agriculture, but also talking to them about soil health practices, talking to them about no-till and cover crops. If we're going to keep this land in agriculture, we also want to make sure that they're aware that there's other practices out there that can enhance, the overall value of that land as it pertains to agriculture production.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that's overlooked sometimes, Chris. And so I'm glad you brought that up. And also that American Farmland Trust does help provide a lot of what we traditionally consider conservation, right? They offer a lot of information and stewardship and facilitation of that as well. Again, kind of in a little bit of a different silo, but they are definitely combined together, and I think really complement each other on this conversation. Paul, when it comes to conservation easements, what are your planning, what are some planning considerations that you think people should think about, when they're maybe contemplating researching this a little bit more, or figuring out if it fits into their strategy?
Yeah, that's a great segue, because there was a question that I saw in the chat that I think is really important that we cover today. And I think the question, I don't see it now, but it was something along the lines of how much can I get paid for an easement? So let's talk about that, because that's something that, comes up from time to time. So to answer that question, and again, I paraphrased your question, but sometimes states have programs where they have money set aside and they have specific property that they are worried, that is in serious threat of development. And those states are willing to purchase your property. And the first thing that they're going to do is obviously put an easement on it. Okay, so that's a whole other conversation. And it really just depends on, the state, and is your land, on that list, that type of thing. Normally, what happens is that if you set up a qualified conservation easement during your lifetime, you are going to get an appraisal, and the appraiser is going to determine the difference between the what the value is subject to an easement versus not subject to an easement. And that's going to be your delta, and that's going to be your charitable income tax deduction. And as Jerry pointed out, that would also remove that value from your gross estate. So it would help get you under those federal and state estate tax exemptions also. So I wanted to mention that, Jen, in as part of your question, because I think often people do think that they get paid to create a conservation easement, and that's pretty rare.
The vast majority are just getting tax benefits. I mean, from a simple perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add. Go ahead, Jerry.
Well, I was just going to add to, sort of emphasize Paul's point about the appraisals, is that traditionally that's how you value conservation easements. And so they're done by, obviously an appraiser who does essentially a unrestricted and restricted appraisal, the differences of value of the easement. And this value, I know there are a number of inquiries like, well, how much is that going to be? And of course, nobody wants to hear this, but it completely depends on the real estate market. I mean, there will be, regardless of where you are, there will be some reduction in value for placing a permanent deed restriction on it. There's no question. The real issue from a sort of financial perspective is, well, is that 10% or 20 or 30 or more? And that really depends on the amount of non-farm development pressure that a particular locality or parcel might be facing. And these can vary. These can be traditional suburban developments on the outer edge of urban areas. They can be large lot developments in areas that maybe have an appeal as second homes that can create a non-agricultural push value. They could be in an area where there's a tremendous amount of interest in, large-scale solar development, again, or near a highway interchange where there might be commercial development opportunities on prime farm ground that just happens to be located near an exit on interstate, insert number here. So there's a lot of factors, and it's very case by case, and it's not satisfying for folks who are trying to figure out, well, what does this mean? But there's really no other way to get at an estimate of value. And one thing I learned a long time ago is it doesn't make sense to guess. So you need to try to get an appraiser, someone who knows the real estate market, to give a sense of, well, what is the market for unrestricted land? And then, obviously, there's a separate market for land restricted to agricultural use, which again, in many areas, depending on the quality of the ag resource, will be substantial, but it's going to be less than, a piece of ground that's completely unrestricted with all options on the table.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up. And yeah, a huge part of the mechanism on why this works is for various planning options. We had a question kind of buried in there, and I want to bring this, is there a legal way to remove or replace the easement to a different location? Or, you know, how does that work if a change needs to happen?
Right. So there are two ways, and this answers another question I saw. There are two ways to essentially terminate a conservation easement. The first is through eminent domain. As folks, I think, understand, it's a very, very broad power. It's very rarely used on conservation easement protected land. It's, as a practical matter, most governments, I think wisely, stay away from conservation land if they can find another parcel of land for that, whatever that public use might be. The other mechanism is generally found in the conservation easement itself, and really applies a traditional property law doctrine of impossible conditions. And basically, I think the example was if, for example, a parcel of land became surrounded by city property, the test would really be, does that make it impossible to farm that land? I would argue in many cases, it may not, because it may change the type of farming. What might change, though, and sadly may happen, is in areas where, say, that land was surrounded by, you know, sort of city real estate and somehow became contaminated. That clearly that land would probably, you know, sort of, I think the easement could be terminated, again, recognizing that that needs to be done by a court. So you have to make a legal proceeding, you have to go before a judge, and a judge has to agree, yes, the purpose of this easement is impossible to fulfill. It's a very high standard, again, by design. You know, these things are designed to be permanent. They, you know, if a state is, or a locality is purchasing them, they're investing a lot of public money in them, or, you know, or substantial tax deductions, which essentially are an indirect cost, but really a significant financial cost to the U.S. or, you know, state government treasury because of the size of some of the tax deductions that are warranted by appraisals. So.
Yeah. I think you gave a good overview, Jerry, of why they are so hard to change, right? Not only from tax implications, but also just from a legal point of view. An easement is meant to be binding on the land and to run indefinitely until it's impossible to carry out anymore. And so I appreciate you giving us a walkthrough of that concept. With that, I think I'm going to try and change or redirect our conversation maybe a little bit more to just succession planning as a bigger concept, because I know these are things that you guys see day in and day out, or are working through with producers and other professionals that are actively, you know, ongoing in this process. And so when it comes to succession planning, besides not planning at all, what is the biggest or the most expensive mistake that you see producers making? And Chris, I'm going to put you on the hot seat. Can you tell us what mistake you see farmers making? You can even say it was yourself, just, you know, to make it easier for people.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think overall we see farmers that you know, continue to farm well into, you know, 50 plus years, 60 some years, you know, and they just don't know how to stop. You know, I think first and foremost, they're very passionate about what they do, but they don't know, you know, they're sometimes, you know, rich with land with that asset, but, you know, can't afford to retire in some cases, and can't afford to, you know, plan to, you know, transfer that land to the next generation. And so I think, you know, we often come across this, you know, pretty frequently, and just farmers don't know what's out there. You know, I think that's why programs like this are great, to really showcase all the different options that farmers and landowners have. And I think it's just important that, you know, everybody has a succession plan, or is at least talking with their family about what they want to do, what their wishes are, and in order for that land to continue in agriculture for that next generation.
Yeah, I think you touched on a really good point, which is, you know, talk to the family, find family goals, you know, find a way to communicate that really puts the family's vision on what they see for the future of the farm. Because it does mean a lot, I think, to all of us in the family. But the specifics of how that plays out sometimes get a little different. So having those conversations before a big event happens, like an unfortunate passing, is good. I think that's a great piece of advice. How about you, Paul? What mistake do you see? You're on the finances, so that's what we're really trying to avoid.
Yeah, I think that some of the most successful succession plans I've seen in farming, as well as similar related businesses, are the fact that they bring in another advisor to that team that you described earlier, that they may have a background in tax or finance or law, but they're really there to be almost a facilitator of the rest of the advisors. And so they're objective, so they're working directly for you. And it's not like your other advisors aren't, but sometimes they can be clouded by ulterior motives. Every advisor can. And so they're almost like this person not only is an ombudsman to really actually kind of facilitate the other advisors and make sure that they're all giving sound advice and it's not clouded by ulterior motives, but they also deal with the softer issues. I mean, Chris, some of Chris's examples are great, but it's really the psychological aspects of dealing with transition, family dynamics. Growing up in Iowa on a farm myself, I just remember countless stories of siblings, being at odds for the rest of their lives, over the parents' estate. And it's really just sad. And that can be prevented by having that good team. But I would add that objective member that's like a facilitator.
Yeah, I think that's some good advice. And yeah, I think we're seeing more and more of that, right? And they might have some professionals, or they might actually have a mediation background.
Yeah,
and
right.
they really see the family through it, because sometimes talking to the attorneys and the finance people, we're a little harsh, right? For lack of a better term. The rules were meant for the majority, but sometimes applied to your situation, it makes you a little upset. And while I try to be very empathetic and sympathetic, there are people out there who are far better at it than me. We'll put it that way. You can.
I'll just add one more thing. I'll just add one more thing there. If you can't find that type of advisor that I just described, sometimes you're again for farm producers especially, your extension in your state may be willing to help you out with some of that. We've been developing what's called a Farm Navigators program at American Farmland Trust, and again to collaborate, with extension offices across the country to be able to help do these types of things as well. So I wanted to throw that in there also.
No, that's great, Paul. It's great to give people some resources, and those are two very good resources to start with. I would recommend as well. How about you, Jerry? You'll be the final one on this question. From your legal perspective, what do we need to avoid besides just avoiding it all together?
Well, I want to circle back to one of the points you started with, Jennifer, because I think it needs reemphasizing and with an exclamation point. And that's, there's a natural desire for parents to want to treat their children equally. And again, in the farming situation, equal is often unfair to the farming child or children. And again, it's easy for me to say that, though I have to say in our family, my father made the wise decision to sell the farm, the dairy farm that I grew up on, to my brother. He didn't consult with anyone because he decided that my brother had earned the opportunity to purchase the farm at a discount. And I do think that sort of dividing the assets equally without recognition that, having non-farming partners, even or perhaps especially because they're related to you, can be very challenging, both from an operational perspective and candidly from a financial perspective. Again, it's not an easy solution to come up with, but I think it's very important for the senior generation to sort of think that through, because again, that's, to Chris's point, if the parents don't make the decision, you can, if you're relying on everyone else to work it out, that often just does not happen and can backfire.
No, I think you're right, Jerry. And I know this from private practice. Those were the cases we saw, right? But it wasn't just a handful. Unfortunately, it seemed to kind of pop up more frequently than we wanted. And even just, purchasing the land that you've always farmed from a sibling can just bring up some interesting dynamics, even if you get it at a discount, right? Repurchasing the family assets sometimes can be more financially stressful than people anticipate. We'll put it that way. So I think you bring up a good point of view. With that, you guys, I think we've all agreed, when should I plan my farm transfer? I think I would always say, forever, right? Like, it's never too early to begin. Unfortunately, tomorrow's not promised for any of us, right? But there is a difference. Sometimes when we see younger producers, we're really doing emergency planning, right? Something completely unexpected happens. When we're working with people who maybe are really looking to retire or to stop being so active in their management, how long do you think succession planning really takes, when it's a foreseeable event? Paul, why don't you start with that one first? How long do you think it really takes to kind of get a succession plan together and then starting to really truly implement it?
Sure. I think getting an estate plan together, you could do that in 3 to 6 months. And there are a lot of big decisions that have to be made, especially if you're going to agree to irrevocably transfer some of your assets for estate tax mitigation purposes. So you really want to give yourself a long runway there, because it's a significant decision. Succession planning is something that could take even longer. It could take maybe up to a year, and it's something where you want to make sure that all the stakeholders are involved. They're all aware of what the long-term plan is, and then you probably want to revisit that maybe every 5 years or so. In addition to your estate plan, they're mutually exclusive, I should say, or not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Paul, right? Unfortunately, these are living documents in some ways. Like, our lives change, so it's not a set it and forget it. They definitely need to be revisited, if not actively managed and done in between as the years go by. How about you, Chris? How long do you really see that these kind of transfers or succession planning, what do you see families doing? Is this kind of a we can get it done in a year situation, or do you see it more extended out?
Yeah, I think it varies, and there was a question in the chat, I want to touch on that relates to this, and just, here in the Midwest, about 60% of the land is already owned by non-operating landowners. These are often either investors or a generation or 2 or 3 removed from the land at this point. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult for, as we talk about succession planning or land transfer, for some of these landowners to find somebody to transition that land to. And so, AFT works with multiple farm link programs across the U.S., some of them like in New York, that we work directly with, others like the one here in Illinois. We work with partners and help promote that program. So I think there's a lot of considerations, because I think in some cases we're seeing landowners that just don't know what to do or don't know, how to transition some of this land to the next generation. And at the same time, we're losing farmers at an increasing rate. We're seeing a lot of farm consolidation. Which is really having an impact on that next generation, whether you're a 5th generation farmer like myself or want to be a 1st generation farmer and getting into agriculture at any scale. It's very challenging. And I think these programs that we've been talking about today, and I know we didn't get a lot of time to talk about buy, protect, sell, but another great option as well, maybe for a future webinar. But I think those are the considerations, and I think the time it takes is really dependent on the team that you have behind you and really what you want to try to accomplish as a landowner.
Oh, those are some good thoughts, Chris. And I like that you gave some cushion to the attorneys in there. They were like, yeah, it should take a little longer. Yeah. But yeah, I hate to cut our conversation off and not give Jerry, you a chance to answer this question, but we're wrapping up to the end of their time. And I do want to give you guys at least 30 seconds each to kind of give your final thoughts, or one last statement, if you will, to the audience that's here today. And Jerry, since I missed you last time, I'll let you go first this time. I know, so lucky. So do you have any final thoughts for our audience?
Well, yeah, I mean, stepping back, I have wrote decades ago a farm estate planning book called Your Land is Your Legacy. And it's really sort of been the core of my approach to integrating farm transfer, succession planning with permanent farmland protection. I think it's a core tenet of my work at AFT. It's a core tenet of AFT's. And I think it's really important, it's not just a financial or a tax issue. I mean, I do believe strongly that, the legacy in the land, agricultural land, is really important. And, it's one of these decisions that is in the hands of the landowners. It's a private property right decision that's exercised by these landowners. And I am always so grateful for the landowners that I've worked with individually and the organization has worked with, and who have made the decision, one way or the other, to permanently protect their land and keep it available for future agricultural use. So I think it's very important, and appreciate all the folks that are on listening, and hope that they can think about, next steps they can take.
Thanks, Jerry. Paul, how about you? Any final last words?
Just in all these conversations over the years, I worked for 2 land grant universities. I worked in estate planning. I think a lot of times what people do is they start approaching institutions or banks or relatives, and they start asking them, what are you going to do with my farmland when I'm gone? And they usually don't like the answer. The answer is usually, we're going to turn around and sell it, and a lot of times what people are really looking for is they're looking for an agricultural easement. They're looking to know that this farm is going to remain in operation, and that since you inherited this land from somebody, or you purchased it, that's the way that you can be a steward going forward. So even if the rest of your succession plan never gets to your optimal plan, by putting an agricultural easement on the property, you've solved a big part of your succession planning problem, if you truly care about that land.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I like the way you approach that. And how about you, Chris? Last but not least, you got 30 seconds for us?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I think I just want to end with, AFT has a lot of great resources on farmlandinfo.org, also our farmland.org website, and great resources that we've got on the call today. I mean, these, Paul and Jerry and others on the AFT team are just absolutely great resources for me as a regional director, and I think for landowners and farmers all across the U.S.
Thanks, Chris. Well, audience, and thank you guys. I got to do a little bit of wrap up stuff, but know that everybody in their home offices is applauding wildly for you. Just almost standing ovations. I'm certain of it.
And
thank you,
as
Jennifer.
well, Jennifer. Yes.
Thanks. So, audience, we have one more poll question for you today. We'd like to know, after this presentation, do you feel more prepared to create a succession plan? Please choose your response directly on the screen, click submit, and we'll share our results here pretty quickly, because I think we have a hard stop. I think they definitely are going to cut me off. So I will definitely try and see if we can get these answers in front of you guys. And at least according to my screen, you all decided you are more prepared than you were before. So thank you. That always feels good to us. I'm glad we can give you guys some more insight. I know that Jerry, Paul, and Chris would be more than happy to, touch base with you guys if you still have some lingering questions. I myself am also available to kind of answer those estate and succession planning questions as they come up, the tools of it, if you will. So feel free to look me up or look any of them up. You have our speaker bios on the bottom. So in the next 24 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation so that you can watch it at your leisure. Feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not been available to listen to this event. And thank you to our sponsor, American Farmland Trust, as well as to everybody in the audience. We appreciate your attention and your participation. This webinar is copyright 2024 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned or copyrighted by Informa Markets. The individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and opinions. You cannot sue ISU or American Farmland Trust. I'm sorry. And on behalf of our guests, Jerry, Paul, Chris, and myself, thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.